The Sopranos is arguably one of the greatest television shows ever made. David Chase's depiction of a fictional Italian-American mob boss struggling to maintain his crime life and his personal life is full of complexity, depth, and themes that make for essential viewing for anyone who loves television dramas. It featured enviable teleplay that featured witty one-liners as well as thought-provoking conversation and dialogue. It paved the way for a lot of television shows to feature more complex, mature themes like Game of Thrones, Breaking Bad, The Wire, etc. It was a show that was ahead of its time like no other. I'll do a top 10 countdown of my top 10 personal favourite episodes. Now, there will be minor and major spoilers throughout this review, so you've been warned. Number 10. Funhouse, Season 2, Episode 13. This featured the death of Big Pussy, one of Tony's close childhood friends. After a bout of food poisoning, which left Tony having bizarre dreams, he comes to the realization that his childhood friend might actually have been the rat underneath his nose the entire time. The episode showed that Tony showed no remorse or exception for whoever he saw as a rat. It was a difficult thing, but he did what he had to do, and Pussy was sleeping with the fishes. Number 9. Join the Club, Season 6, Part 1, Episode 2. In my opinion, Season 6, Part 1 peaked too early. After Uncle Junior shoots Tony in the first episode of Season 6, this episode features Tony in a coma state where he has dreams in which he imagines himself as another person, an everyman, known as Kevin Finley, who basically lives a normal life, who loves his wife and children, who's just alone, tender, and confused. This represented the idea that Tony was in a vulnerable state in his coma, and we genuinely worried that Tony might not actually get through this ordeal. Number 8. Kennedy and Heidi, Season 6, Part 2, Episode 6. Whilst I was watching Season 1, there was a moment when I thought to myself that Christopher Moltisanti was definitely going to be a thorn in Tony's side throughout the series. In this episode, Christopher becomes very unfocused and lacking concentration by not keeping his eye on the road, swerves off the road, resulting in a car crash. Tony is okay, but Christopher is more injured than he is. He then reveals to Tony that he had actually been taking drugs prior and he would lose his license if he took the blame. Tony notices that in the back seat, the baby seat has been crushed and impaled by a tree branch. This causes Tony to do one of the coldest things he's done throughout the series. He murders his nephew in what was a very emotionless state. What makes this part so scary is he didn't even need to think about killing Christopher. As soon as he found out he was on drugs, and when he saw the damaged baby seat, he realised Christopher wasn't just a hazard to himself, he was a hazard to the people around him. The idea that Christopher swerved off the road due to his lack of concentration on the road whilst driving symbolises his lack of focus which he had throughout this series, with his constant use of on-again, off-again drug abuse, constant on-again, off-again idea of making a movie, and his violent temper. Number 7. The Blue Comet, Season 6, Part 2, Episode 8. The penultimate episode was probably more of a high point than the final episode which followed. It featured the last time that Dr. Melfi and Tony had their sessions. After Melfi comes to the conclusion that therapy is not helping Tony become a better person, but it's helping him become a better criminal. She realises what she should have probably realised all along. Tony is a sociopath. This also featured the tipping point of the war between between New York and New Jersey crime family, which had been in the making for a while. With the death of Bobby and Silvio being put into a coma, this forces Tony to go into hiding. Number 6. Whoever Did This, Season 4, Episode 9. Ralphie Cifaretto had always been a very polarizing character. He was probably one of the biggest love-hate characters on the show. He was violent and ambitious, but at the same time, he was also charismatic and charming. He was a classic textbook sociopath, I guess you could say. A lot of my favourite wisecracks actually came from Ralphie, believe it or not. However, back in Season 3, I think it was Silvio Christopher who remarked that Ralphie was going to end up in the back of somebody's trunk one of those days. Well, let's just say after an accident with his son leaves Ralphie in a vulnerable state mentally, and after Tony finds out that Ralphie and his co-owned racehorse Pyomai was killed after a stable fire, he then suspects Ralphie did it in order to claim the insurance money. When he confronts Ralphie, Ralphie neither denies or accepts the blame. However, he sets Tony off when he remarks that it was just a horse. This caused Tony to impulsively kill Ralphie, despite Ralphie being a made man and one of his best earners. The fact is, Tony killed somebody over a horse. This showed that Tony was now willing to kill people with no regard for who they were. Number 5. Employee of the Month, Season 3, Episode 4. Probably one of the most shocking episodes of the show. Dr. Melfi is attacked and then raped in a car parking lot on the way home from work. During this episode, she is denied justice by the police department after they are forced to let the perpetrator go due to a bureaucratic error. This causes Melfi great pain, and she goes as far as to consider asking Tony to beat up and even kill her rapist. However, after having a talk with her own therapist, she then does something that left a lot of viewers shocked and in denial. She decides to take the moral high ground and not ask Tony to get back at her rapist. Despite the fact she was denied justice, she chose to do the right thing. I remember watching this episode for the first time and I sat on the edge of my seat, shocked, as Tony asks her during the last minute, "Is there something wrong?" And after a long silence, she sternly answers, "No." Number 4. Whitecaps, Season 4, Episode 13. The Season 4 finale saw the potential of a breakout war between Tony and Johnny Sack. However, there was a war, but it wasn't between Sack and Tony, it was a domestic war. You see, Tony and Carmela weren't exactly what I would call a marriage made in heaven. Tony was constantly committing endless amount of adultery against her, and Carmela was a materialistic stay-at-home housewife lacking ambition. You didn't have to be a brain genius to work out that their marriage was in serious trouble. In this episode, we see the breaking point for Carmela as Irina, one of Tony's previous mistresses, calls home to taunt her about Tony's infidelity. After Furio left, it was obvious that Carmela was unhappy even more of her marriage. All she needed was one thing to set her off, and Irina's taunting was the straw that broke the camel's back. In what had to be one of the most brutal and very believable realistic fights in this season, which ironically ended in no bloodshed. It was a harrowing, difficult thing to watch, and it earned both James Gandolfini and Edie Falco very much deserved Emmy Awards. Number 3. Long-Term Parking, Season 5, Episode 12. The penultimate episode of Season 5 saw the potential breakout of a war between the New York crime families and New Jersey crime families due to Tony Blundetto's antics. Tony also moves back into the house after offering Carmela a spec house as well. However, this episode contained probably one of the saddest moments of the show. Years of being an FBI informant leads Adriana to crumble under the pressure, and she finally comes clean to Christopher about being a mole. After nearly strangling her to death and coming to his senses, Christopher considers going into witness protection with her. However, Tony later on calls Adriana as she's packing to tell her that Christopher attempted suicide and that Silvio would take her to the hospital. However, we see Christopher is all okay. We start to realise Silvio wasn't driving Adriana to the hospital. He was driving her to her death. In what was one of the most heart-wrenching and difficult to watch death scenes of the show, we saw a character who we genuinely wanted to see survive the show killed off. Number 2, College, Season 1, Episode 5. If I could choose an episode to define a television show, I would say College best defines The Sopranos for what it is. What separates The Sopranos from other fictional mob work is that it's about a mob boss who's trying to separate his business life with his family life. This is the first episode to really show it in full force. We see Tony taking Meadow up to Maine to scout for colleges. However, whilst there, he spots a former rat in witness protection hiding up there. It leads to the first time we see Tony actually killing someone off. This shows Tony in both sides, the loving, caring family man, but also the ruthless mobster. On a side note, we also see Carmela kind of questioning her relationship with Tony and her marriage. Number 1, Pine Barrens, Season 3, Episode 11. This fan favourite sees Christopher and Polly on an errant collection run, which Silvio should have been taking for one of Tony's Russian contacts called Valerie. After the deal goes wrong, they have to dispose and kill him. However, when they go to the Pine Barrens wilderness in New Jersey, he ends up escaping, and after appearing to be fatally shot by Polly, ends up running away still. This causes Polly and Christopher to get lost in the Barrens, and what follows is some of the funniest moments of The Sopranos ever. This episode also sees Tony starting to realise that Gloria may not be so perfect after all, as he starts to see her fiery temper on full display. What makes this episode so unique is though, it's the theories surrounding what happens to Valerie the Russian. He's never actually seen again throughout the show. People argue, is he still alive? Is he dead? There's so much debate as to what happens, which is what I think keeps people coming back to this episode in particular. So that was my personal top 10 pick. Remember, this is subjective. My other honourable mentions would have been I Dream of Janine Casamano, From Where to Eternity, Knight in White Shining Armour. It's the episode where Tony's mother dies. It's like the Russian sounding one. I think it's like Good Night Olivia in Russian. Amor Vo, Where's Johnny, Members Only, Sopranos Home Movies, and Mayhem. I can definitely see why The Sopranos is one of the greatest television shows ever made. Why don't you say in the comments what your favourite episodes are and discuss? Thanks for watching.